I want to start by saying what you're about to hear may be a bit disturbing. Now, I'm nobody special, just your average run-of-the-mill guy. I go to work, I come home, have a joint, and go to bed. Not much else to say, really. However, it was an experience I had while hiking in the wilderness of the Oregon high desert that had a profound effect on my day-to-day life. I live in a small town in the midst of the high desert. I'll not mention its name for privacy reasons, and it probably wouldn't concern anyone even if I did. Besides, this experience didn't take place in my hometown, but rather a few miles west of it. It was a hot, dry Friday, typical of this area. I was incredibly bored, as my boss had told me to take the day off, as service was unusually slow. At first, I was thrilled at the chance to sit around in my apartment and chill for 3 days. However, after binge-watching the first season of a favorite TV show and playing some stupid simulator game on my computer, I began to feel the effects of that weekend burnout you get when you've exhausted your typical options. It was around 6 when I looked out of my window. The afternoon sun blazed down on the pavement outside, creating those familiar swirls of heat. I smiled at the sunshine, and without much thought, I began packing up my camping supplies. I travel light, being a frequent backpacker, so it didn't take long, and soon I was driving away from my house in my piece of junk Plymouth minivan. The sounds of rock and roll filled my ears as I sailed down the straight, boring highway. Juniper trees sailed past, mixed with the greenish-brown color of the landscape. I've never been much of a fan of this area, but it's home. Hell, I've lived here my whole life, for God's sake. It was about 7 when I saw what I was looking for. An old dirt road, cutting away from the highway. Turning onto it, I began the slow crawl into the woods. It was about 4:30 at this time, and I was excited. The midday sun still high in the sky, and I hoped I was lucky enough to get some hiking in before the day was done. This never worked out. The rough and dusty road I traveled on was longer than I expected, and by the time I found a suitable place to camp, it was already showing signs of the sun setting. I sighed in some annoyance and turned off the car. Stepping outside, I was overwhelmed by how quiet it was. The wind rustled the trees, and there were a few birds calling, but not much else. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the wind blow across my face. Nature. It's always made me feel so alive. Pulling myself away from the momentary distraction, I pulled my tent from the car. It took me about 10 minutes to set it up in a nearby patch of dirt, despite its small size. The winds didn't help either, as the tent kept flapping about in my face. Finally, though, I had it completed, along with a small campfire. I sat by the fire, reading a favorite book until the sun was in that gray twilight stage. I reasoned that at this point there wasn't much else to do but go to sleep, so I did. The night was cool, and I could hear the howling of coyotes echoing in the distance, but I ignored them and soon fell asleep. I awoke early the next day, before the sun was even up, and as soon as I had finished my breakfast and put on my backpack, I hiked out into the wilderness. I made it a point to follow the winding path of 2 rocky cliffs, and soon found the path heading downhill into a valley. Now, the one thing you must understand about the high desert is that it's full of hills, and the landscape had a rounded shape because of it. Even though they're usually covered in trees and shrubs, from a distance they look like giant flat domes, spotted with the same greenish-brown look the whole area has. It was this that I was looking at as I neared the lip of the valley, which was somewhat bowl-shaped. Looking down, however, I spotted something. It was a house, sitting directly at the bottom of the valley. It looked old, and no smoke rose from the stone chimney that crested it. Curiously, I started towards it, tightening the chest strap on my backpack. I've always been somewhat of an adventurous person, and the idea of abandoned places fascinated me. As I drew closer to the house, I wondered the entire way why someone would want to live in such an inconvenient place. There was no cell service out here, and from what I could tell, no power lines or generators were around the property. The signs of abandonment became even more apparent as I stepped out onto the property. The windows were covered with dust, their rustic wooden shutters hanging loose by rusty nails. A single willow tree sat in the front yard, an ancient wooden swing moving back and forth like a pendulum, hanging depressingly by one rotten rope. I saw an old truck, once red but now caked in dirt and rust, sitting on airless tires in the driveway. The truck's windows were shattered, and there was a large pile of stuff, covered by a rotting tarp in the bed. As I approached the front of the house, I took out my flashlight and shined it through the wooden screen door. I say a screen door, but the screen was long gone at this point, and the wooden frame looked one strong gust of wind away from falling over. This actually happened when I tried to open the door, startling me and causing me to jump back. I'm an adventurous person, but I've always been easily startled, a trait which pisses me off to no end. I mentally kicked myself for jumping at shadows and walked through the now unblocked opening. The old floorboards creaked beneath my leather hiking boots, and I shielded my nose and mouth from the unsettled dust my movements had kicked up. Shining my light through the gloom, I looked past the entrance into a dirty living room. Rotting couches lined the walls, their yellow stuffing busting out like piss-caked clouds. A stone fireplace sat on the far wall, blackened from most likely what was countless uses. There was even an old rusted pot sitting inside, atop what looked like a pile of ashen logs. The room smelled musty, and I didn't dare guess what kind of nasty parasites lived within the rotting depths of those couches. I turned from the living room left, coming into what I took to be a kitchen. Old, hand-carved wooden cupboards and shelves covered the walls, and an assortment of wooden spoons lay scattered across the floor, most likely from the fallen drawer that accompanied them. A single window sat above a steel wash basin, allowing the morning sun to stream into the room. Beneath the window was a rusty steel washbin. I peered inside and gagged at the rancid smell. About 2 inches of brown, murky water sat at the bottom. I covered my nose, disgusted, and headed back to the entrance. It was at this point that I had begun to be bored with the place. It didn't seem to be anything interesting, just an old, forgotten house left to be destroyed by time. I had just stepped outside when a sudden pain exploded in the back of my head. And for a split second, I registered that I was falling. Then, I blacked out. I awoke to the feeling of water dripping onto my forehead. I couldn't see anything, and for a moment, I thought I was blind. A horrible ringing was in my ears, and I could taste blood in my mouth. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and I reached out my hand. It scraped against wet stone. I also felt something like moss cake my hands. I realized quickly that I was not lying atop my bag, but on my back. My bag was gone, as was my flashlight. I felt cold, and my skin felt wet and slimy, as if I had been submerged in something not long ago. I then became aware that I was lying atop a slab of wood, like a piece of plywood. I sat up and peered into the darkness. The steady dripping of water continued on the wood behind me. Nothing, not a sight or sound. I stood slowly. My head gradually stopped spinning. I rubbed my eyes, trying to regain my consciousness. Cautiously, I took a slow step forward, my foot splashing into something cold and wet. I realized at this point that my boots were gone too. I thought, the last thing I need is to step on a nail without any shoes on. I put the thought out of my mind and pushed forward, arms outstretched. One by one, I stepped into the darkness, startled when I touched the mossy stone. My heart was pounding at this point, and I thought for a second that I might pass out again. I steadied myself, fighting to stay awake. I took a few deep breaths, which did little to calm my nerves, and began walking alongside the stone wall. It turned a sharp 90 degrees before I felt my left hand touch solid metal. Feeling around it, I realized it was a door. I tried the round handle. Locked. "No," I whispered. I was just about to begin walking again when, suddenly, I heard the lock click. Backing away quickly, I steeled myself for whatever would open the door. When it opened, I was greeted with an oppressively bright light. In the light was the silhouette of a large man. He was about 6.5 feet tall, and incredibly muscular. Even in the darkness, I could make out the sheer mass of his bulky arms. Without a doubt, I knew that this guy could easily hurt me very badly. This knowledge made my stomach churn and my blood go cold. He took a few steps towards me, his boot-clad feet splashing in whatever muck I was standing in. I steeled myself for something I wasn't even sure of, when he grabbed me by the arm. His grip was incredibly strong, and I felt my hands go numb from just how hard he was squeezing. He pulled me through the door, not saying a word. Now that I was in the light once again, my eyes stung. I didn't dare look at his face, imagining all sorts of horrors that could be there. My imagination ran wild, and my heart thumped like a shotgun in my chest. I felt short of breath, and my vision was cloudy. Just as I thought I couldn't stand for another second, I was thrown forcibly to the ground. The familiar feel of wood met my hands, and I became aware that I was in the living room again. The light of the campfire, now burning brightly, illuminated the room. Looking at the windows, I realized that I could see the moon shining in. How long have I been out? I thought. This thought, however, was replaced by a puzzling horror. The man behind me had not moved. He just stood there, standing over me. I looked up at the fire and saw a single wooden chair. It was like the kind of chairs you put at a dinner table, or set on your front patio. A thin, stooped figure sat in the chair, warming its thin hands by the fire. I could see faint wisps of cigarette smoke coming from its mouth. I didn't speak. My mouth felt horribly dry, and a vile taste stung the back of my throat. I suppose you're wondering why you're in this position, the thin figure asked in a low, dry voice. I said nothing. Fear constricted my vocal cords. Allow me to explain something, Nathan, the figure said, not turning towards me. I have waited a very long time for one such as yourself to come here. Why? I rasped, unsure of anything else to say. Another puff of smoke issued from the figure's mouth. It chuckled in a low, almost sarcastic way. They always ask why, never who, it said, cocking its head to the left. The figure then began to stand, and above the crackle of the fire, I could make out the distinct pop of bones sliding into place. It turned, and as my eyes met its own, I felt my heart sink. They were entirely black, surrounded by pale, bloodless skin. The face was gaunt, like a corpse, with sunken cheeks and an angular jaw. It looked horribly malnourished, like the person had not eaten in several months. It took one step towards me, and I realized that it was breathing heavily. It loomed over me a second later, its thin shape silhouetted by the fire's glow. Reaching out with a pale hand, it caressed my face. I winced in shock. The skin was cold, grave-like, and the nails were long and thick. I looked up into its darkened face and was horrified to see the light of the moon glistening off its bone-white teeth. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond to my commands. It was like I was tied up, held tightly by unknown hands. The figure opened its mouth, and I could smell the rancid scent of death on it. It was the smell, actually, that caused my reflexes to kick in. Immediately, I shot up, my head connecting with the figure's jaw. I ran, then ducking underneath the large man's swinging arm and tearing out the doorway. It was dark, but by the direction of the front door, I remembered which way I came. I began to run, my legs carrying me like lightning, when suddenly I heard a horrible bang resounding behind me. Bits of buckshot skittered past, one burning my exposed leg as it whizzed by. I looked back to see the large man holding a double-barreled shotgun, the lanky figure hobbling behind him. I ducked behind a pile of rocks, just as another blast from the shotgun surged by. The shotgun was empty, and even as I peered up over the rocks, I could see the large man holding it once more. I took the opportunity and ran as fast as I could, staying as low as I possibly could. Another blast skittered by, sending bits of rock flying like shrapnel in all directions. I shielded my face and began climbing up the hill out of the valley. Looking back, I saw the large man running towards me at full speed, his huge feet thumping hard against the dusty ground. I was choking for breath, but he looked to be hardly breaking a sweat. He still clutched the shotgun, and I was only just able to throw myself to the ground before another blast broke the night's silence. I was showered once more with bits of rock and dirt. With shaky breaths, I hauled myself to my feet, looking back again. The man was climbing the hill. In fact, he had almost climbed halfway at this point. My stomach lurched as adrenaline once again surged through my veins. I tripped and stumbled along the rocky path. All the while, I kept looking back to see that the man was still gaining on me and still holding the gun. I saw the colorful outline of my tent and my heart soaring as I rounded a corner. I sprinted towards it, giving every last ounce of strength I could muster. I had just gotten to my tent and fished the car keys out of my sleeping bag when I felt pain surge through my leg. Warm blood dripped on my skin. I looked down to see that there was a small hole in my right calf. The shotgun. I tore myself out of the tent amidst the pain just as the large man grabbed me by the leg. His iron grip on my fresh wound burned like fire, and I screamed in pain. He grabbed hold of my chest and began to lift me off the ground. I then remembered my keys still in my hand. Looking up into the man's face, I was horrified to see a beaten and scarred visage staring back at me. The eyes were dark and bloodshot. With all I could, I punched the man in the right eye with my car key, the metal shaft sinking squarely into his eye. He screamed, a low, hollow sound, and dropped me. I stumbled, crumpling due to my injured leg, and crawled for the shotgun. It lay on the ground, open, one shell still in the chamber. I grabbed the gun, my hands feeling the cold metal and wood, and cocked it back into place. At the same moment, I felt the man's hands grab my legs again. I tried twisting around to aim the gun at him, but he held me in place, so I risked it. I turned the gun upside on its stock and rested the barrel atop my head. I had just felt the man grab my waist when I pulled the trigger. The air exploded around me and my ears rang. The grip stopped, and I felt the huge shape go flying back. Dirt was kicked into my eyes by the butt of the gun scraping with the force. I took a breath and choked on the dust, pushing myself to my feet. The shotgun fell to the ground with a clatter. I limped to the car, unlocking it and pulling myself inside. Shoving the key into the ignition, I turned it quickly. The car sputtered to life, and I was just about to put it into reverse when I heard a loud slapping sound on the glass of my passenger side window. I looked in terror to see the large man, his left shoulder entirely missing, and blood spurting from his veins. He stared at me, pounding with his arm against the glass. He was holding a rock, and the glass shattered on the third hit. Instinctively, I put the car into reverse and floored it. Clouds of dust billowed up around us as the car surged backwards, knocking the large man to the ground. I slammed on the brake, putting the car in drive and stamping back down on the gas pedal. The front of the car slammed into the large man, who was lifting himself to his feet, and I heard a loud splat as his head hit the bumper. I cut the wheel and floored it back down the road, leaving behind the body and my camping gear. The car bounced and skidded, and more than a few times I thought I would fly off the road. But somehow, and much to my relief, I saw the highway, lit up with hundreds of cars. I only stopped to turn into the highway, and just as I was about to, I looked up into the rearview mirror. I could have sworn I saw the thin figure standing there, puffing on that cigarette. I didn't think about it and turned onto the highway, flooring it home. It was close to midnight when I pulled up to my house. I pulled my bloodied keys from the ignition and just sat there for a moment, staring out at my garage. Eventually, I got out of the car and headed inside. It's been 2 years since that event, but it still feels like yesterday. I don't go camping alone anymore, especially in the wilderness. Every time I pass that stretch of highway, I wonder just how close I came to death. I haven't told anyone about the experience, but after 2 years, I think it's time. Be safe out there, folks. And most of the wilderness is just that, the open wilderness. But I believe that there are places in this world which are simply just evil. Watch out for yourselves. It was a land where the night stretched on forever, and the heat boiled in the soil long after the sun had been swallowed by the darkness. Me and my two good friends, Macklin and Anthony, were adventurers. Born and raised in the same suburban American neighborhood, we were brothers through mateship. After school, the three of us somewhat split paths. Mac and myself went to college. Anthony went on to join the military. However, through it, we never lost our ties together. And to ensure that we never did, a tradition was born. Egypt, Europe, Mexico, Japan, India, all the same odd corners of Asia, we'd been next to everywhere. It was a vacation that the three of us exclusively planned a trip for annually. Now in our early 30s, we'd seen a fair amount. The different religions, cultures, food, music, languages, the lists go on. In that time, as one could imagine, the trouble we'd gotten ourselves into. Getting lost in a rural, unknown area wasn't an unfamiliar occurrence for us, but we'd always managed to pull through just fine in the end. But I guess luck can run out. Camping. It was a favorite activity of ours. And where better than rural Australia? On the bottom side of the earth, where the stars we were born under were now foreign. Besides, could you really say you've traveled the world if you haven't been to the one and only land down under? It was a wonder we hadn't been before. Despite the foreign country that we admittedly didn't know much about, other than the land's affinity for deadly animals, we were eager to dive all in, head first. We'd touched down in Perth, before renting out a jeep for a couple weeks and heading up over to Uluru, where we'd stay at the campground nearby for a night or two, before moving on. We'd done a couple quick Google searches, which, now that I looked back on it, really wish I had done more thoroughly, and thought it a smart idea to simply cut through the Northern Territory and head straight into Queensland, off-road and all. Perhaps we had a little too much faith in our GPS. I'm not going to lie. Reliable GPS or not, everywhere we'd been in Australia, the service had been pretty terrible. It wasn't any better in the outback. As you could expect, we got lost. Very lost. Of course, we'd packed a couple extra gas cans, or debatably jerry cans, but alas, we burnt through those quicker than we'd be willing to admit. We camped out in the car for a day or so, hoping someone would come by, but it was obvious the only people around that could help us were ourselves. So eventually we packed up, only bringing the bare necessities and our phones, which were effectively useless with no bars of reception. I couldn't tell you how long we walked. I wouldn't say it was days, and despite Anthony having been in the military for however many years now, this was no Bear Grylls episode. In fact, if it weren't for Anthony, we'd probably still be back there. Bones eaten away by the red terrain of the hungry earth of the outback. Luckily for us, Anthony knew a thing or two on navigating using the Southern Cross. We were already on the lower side of Northern Territory. We figured at some point we'd have to hit the border of South Australia, or a road at some point. It was Anthony who kept us on track with our rations, and overall kept up morale. I have him to thank forever for effectively saving my life, at least for that long. If it were just me on my own, it scares me to admit I would have succumbed to the parch burning at the back of my throat, and the choking sensation of something standing right behind me. But alas, I was all alone, excluding Anthony and Mac, of course. I remember pushing through the drapes of darkness one night, worn boots scuffling across the coarse ground. I'd been in desolate areas before, where intelligent life existed for miles and other than my two buddies, but the silence that we staggered through was one that I've failed to forget. It was deafening, smothering. It sat in a pit of your stomach and weighed on your shoulders. Nothing but silence, the shuffling of feet, and the haggard breaths escaping mouths that couldn't seem to suck the air back up fast enough. I, for whatever reason, had deemed it fit I took the lead, despite not being the one navigating. I guess it was just a domineering trait of mine. one that still causes conflict within me to arise whenever I ponder if, at the time, that had been a good or bad thing. Perhaps it was a good thing, as it meant I didn't have to look back, which, to anyone who wasn't there, must seem like a silly thing. But oh, I can describe to you how much I dreaded looking back at the time. Too breathless to speak, we all traveled in silence, and with not much else to do, it began a desperation to find something, anything to listen to, which, for me, was merely the breathing of my companionship. It was calming, I guess. The reassurance that I wasn't alone, something that I could pace my own breathing to. I can't convey the words I need to describe the nausea felt when I counted 4 lots of haggard breathing. I remember freezing, right in my tracks. There was the overwhelming urge to look back. However, a certain primal fear in me, rather, made me question why nobody had questioned my sudden halt in pace. It was then I realized I couldn't remember the last time I heard the shuffling of feet over earth other than mine. The breathing continued, 3 more sets other than mine, but the sounds of footsteps never sounded. I thought, briefly, perhaps I was imagining the 3rd set of lungs. Maybe Anthony and Mac had paused, but still hadn't caught their breaths enough to talk. I paused, for a moment longer, staring into the inky abyss ahead of me. Prayers urging the kisses of warm colors that would eventually splash across the sky to hurry in its ascent. Maybe the prayer hotline was busy, because there was no response from God. I think back, and I remember that feeling. An ice that had settled in my bones that I'd failed to realize until I once again reached civilization. No, there was no God there. He couldn't reach into whatever darkness that swallowed the land there. So, at the time, I did the only thing I thought was a rational response. Since, obviously, I wasn't going to turn around, I did the next best thing. I dropped my phone and kept walking. I couldn't explain to you why I was so convinced that I had to keep facing forward, but maybe, by some chance, though God couldn't enter this darkness, his whispers could carry far enough to warn me of the danger that likely leered no further than a few feet behind me, for what had to be hours. However, despite my attempts to evoke a response from the two, I found myself choking on the terrifying realization. There was no way they could have missed that. Even under the pools of ink held in heavens, the illumination of the moon was enough to bring the silhouettes of every potentially terrifying figure in the distance to life. At the time, I thought, surely they'd pick my phone up for me, and at the very least try and string out something intelligible from their raspy throats to let me know I had dropped it. For a long time, I was wondering if my phone was still there, sitting out in the desert on the opposite side of the world, or whether some animal had found it and scurried off with it. I wondered if someone else had stumbled upon it, and each time I did, I felt guilty. Guilty, knowing that the phone only served as a symbol of the despair to come. Despite the overwhelming paranoia eating away at my conscience, I marched forward, perhaps with more motivation this time. I must have walked for another hour or so, and I promise you, in that time not once did I stop or glare anywhere but straight forward. The only shuffling of foots to be heard were my own, but the breathing never ceased. I was scared shitless, afraid, because eventually I knew I would have to look back. And when I did, what would I find? And if I turned only to find it was nothing, that the breathing was in my head, I was afraid because where had Anthony and Mac gone? Believe it or not, it wasn't easy to lose someone in the empty plains of the desert. You could shout and your voice would carry for miles. That was when, by some miracle, I stumbled upon a road, not paved or particularly large, but a road nonetheless. At this point, I was seriously considering devoting my life to God and becoming whatever the male equivalent of a nun was, if there even was one. There was only one problem. The road stretched to my left and right. If you hadn't caught on yet, I had been avoiding turning around to any degree, so I was left with a serious problem. Turn around and finally face my fears, or continue forward and hope I would stumble upon another road before my legs gave in under my body's own weight. At the time, neither was a viable option for me, so instead I stood, stuck still by the edge of the unpaved road, and prayed by God that the breathing behind me didn't decide to keep walking forward anyway. And by some luck, they remained at what sounded like the same distance as before, while I cautiously slipped my bag out to ruffle around in it in hopes of finding a torch of some sort, or anything really, to distract myself with. I could continue to describe to you in detail the kind of bone-chilling, heart-sinking dread I experienced in those moments, but instead I'll briefly skip over what had to be hours of waiting by the road, in hopeless anticipation of a car passing by, urging every fiber of my body to keep myself upright while I fiddled with my empty flask, once filled with water. At some points I considered calling out for Anthony and Macklin, but each time the words sunk in my throat, and I eventually came to the conclusion that my unconscious self just might know more about my current situation than my conscious self did. Now I eternally thank Anthony for saving my life thus far, but it wouldn't be true at all if it weren't for someone else entirely. A young Australian woman, whose name I can still hear in my dreams but can never seem to translate into comprehensive words, in her worn pickup truck, came bubbling down the road in the dead of night. The relief and terror I felt when its headlights came into my peripheral vision could only be described as the most immense and intense emotions I'd experienced in my life. Not even the grief for the two guys I'd call my brothers' disappearance quite matched up with it. Perhaps it was selfish, and the guilt eats at me every day for it. But now that I had escaped for the meantime, with each day that passed, the more I was sure that I would have lost a whole lot more than my life if I'd never gotten in that vehicle that night. Desperate, I flailed my arms in hopes that they would pull over, and sure enough, a white pickup truck came stuttering to a halt right in front of me. From the driver's seat, a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, quirked a cautious brow at me.
Jesus, what the hell are you doing out here?
I almost laughed. A weight was lifted. It was like all the dread and aching of tired joints and sore muscles had disappeared. Realistically, I knew my exhausted body was still waiting for the euphoria of relief to disappear, but the feeling of no longer being alone was easily the second most intense feeling I'd ever experienced. The woman rolled her dark eyes, muttering to herself,
"Well, get in. You look like shit."
I didn't hesitate, pulling open the passenger's door and jumping right inside, the fear of turning long forgotten. I'm sure the pure forcefulness I'd used to shut the door and the eagerness to slap on my belt would have looked odd to any other person, but looking over to her, that woman with the dark hair pulled back into a simple ponytail and the amused gleam in her eyes, I was under the impression that the vehicle I'd gotten in wasn't necessarily any safer than back outside. Unfortunately, I knew it was the only option left for me, if I wanted a solid chance of getting out alive, that is. She was quick to take off soon afterwards, and I got the impression she was just as much aware of what could be lurking in the darkness. The truck was small but cozy. The outside was a little worn, but the inside was very well taken care of. A couple blankets were thrown across the back seat, and an empty baby booster was strapped in the middle of the back seat. I furrowed my eyes at it before glancing back over at the woman, who was easily going over 120 kilometers an hour at the time. "You got a kid?" I remember the pain that shot through my throat at the simple words.
Wow, you sound like shit too. There's some water in the console. Help yourself.
Not one to complain for small blessings, I drank the entire bottle, the cool liquid serving as relief for the fire sizzling in my limbs. Surprisingly, I wasn't as tired at the time as I thought I would be. Perhaps it was the fear knowing I still hadn't quite escaped. The dread of looking outside and looking whatever had stood behind me in the eye.
Also, no, It's for my nephew.
I nodded, a million questions in my head, but the uncertainty of where to start kept them tame in my mind. Eventually, I found the right words. Is this a busy road?
No.
I have expected her to elaborate, but apparently not. I'd found up until now most of the Australians I had encountered were great conversationalists, but I suppose that couldn't apply to everyone. Maybe the accent had something to do with it. I had an assertive tone to it. Honestly, I was almost surprised when she continued the conversation herself.
So, how'd you find yourself out here?
I was hesitant to say anything at first, but figured it couldn't hurt. I let her in on our original plan. I let her know how we'd gotten lost, and I'd gotten separated from my friends at some points, leaving out the whole breathing thing, obviously. At the time, I remember glaring at my shoes while I explained this to her. I remember what looked like a freshly vacuumed carpet and polished dashboard. I remember because I recall looking up in surprise at the outrageous casualness in her next words.
Yep, she hummed. They're dead.
I'd gotten mad at the time. Slipped a few unfriendly words in and boldly exclaimed a couple of "how dare yous." She was talking about my family, for God's sake. Surprisingly, though, she didn't reply nearly as upset as I thought she would. Instead, despite the lethal speeds she was traveling at, she calmly, coolly twisted my way to look me in the eyes. In that instant, I felt my anger dissipate quicker than I thought humanly possible. It felt unnatural, almost as if my anger had been stolen from me rather than put out. Glancing back to the road, she cleared her throat.
Yeah, no. I get where you're coming from, but I'm just saying it how it is. You're pretty lucky you're here with me now.
Staring at her strangely, I felt at that time was the better time to ask a few more questions that I realized later on certainly sounded a little crazy. What could have killed them? I don't even understand how they could have disappeared like that. It doesn't make sense. Chuckling, she cut me off.
But nothing makes sense around here, right? You just gotta roll with it.
I furrowed my brows, that sinking feeling of danger growing. You don't seem to care very much that two people potentially just lost their lives. A toothy grin, a grin that glinted an intention I could never quite place, curled at her lips.
And you seem awfully calm for someone who just found out two of his friends are dead.
Frozen, the words slumped in my throat. She wasn't wrong. Sure, I was pretty terrified, but what kind of person could rationally hold a conversation like this after everything? At first, I thought I was in shock, but I knew it was wishful thinking. To this day, I still don't know. I'm not entirely sure whether that kind of coldness had always been inside of me, simply unearthed, or whether it was instilled in me from the ice-cold terror that sunk in my bones during that night that failed to melt away. Yet another guilt to suffocate in.
You know,
She started.
you're the second person I've ever seen on this road before.
Quite numbly, I peered over at her, half stuck in my thoughts, still trying to register the previous statement. You use that road often?
Oh yeah, she hummed. A couple of times a month, at least.
And nobody else uses this road? She huffed in amusement.
Nah, nobody with any kind of common sense would come down this way.
Why not? God, that grin. It spread across her lips as if that was exactly what she was expecting me to say. The atmosphere in that car, it felt like the entire night had been one big game, like all I was some sort of predictable creature beneath her to be used and played with. She snorted.
Of course you don't know.
Her dark eyes flickering over my way.
This entire area is haunted, you know.
I froze at the words. It felt like an affirmation.
Not by ghosts, though, she drawled on. No, not those harmless things. Something much meaner.
I felt like all the air in the vehicle had been sucked from the truck. And these mean things, they're why nobody uses this road. Her grin grew wider.
Why'd you think I'm flogging it down the road as fast as I am now?
That one sentence still keeps me up at night. It made me wonder just how fast those mean creatures could go. They weren't ghosts, because in comparison, ghosts were harmless. And that terrified me. Then why'd you pull over for me? I peered over at her curiously, hearts twisting in all the wrong ways as I fearfully avoided looking out her window. She shrugged.
It's not me they're interested in.
I think I might have soiled myself a little bit then. And they're interested in me? She shook her head.
Not so much. That's why they got those mates of yours, and not you.
I furrowed my brows. But I thought I heard them following me before. I could hear their breathing, 3 of them. I couldn't hear any footsteps. This time she paused, staring wide-eyed at the streets ahead of her. It was silence for a few seconds. It was deafeningly quiet, and I was too afraid to question why the tires rolling across the dirt road didn't make any noise. Slowly, she twisted her head to face me, not bothering to slow down, but rather picking up the speed.
Ah, mate, scratch that then.
It took all of my will to choke out my next words. Scratch what? She glanced back at the road.
Scratch them not being interested in you. No, they're more interested in you in that case.
I could hear my heart throbbing in my head. I felt like my chest would explode. Why? She shook her head for a second, jaw opening only to clack shut as she seemingly searched for the right words to say.
Look, those things, this isn't the only place where you'd find them. She sighed. No, those things, they're everywhere. Not just in the deserts, but in your neighborhoods, in your garage, behind the bedroom door you forget to close properly. Everywhere. You won't see them. If you do, you won't know it's them. The door that you swore you shut a couple minutes ago. That light you could have promised your life on that you turned off. Them. That scratching in your roof and walls at night when you already had the place checked out for rats or possums or whatever. Them. Her grip tightened on the wheel. Fucking everywhere. Probably right here, in this car with us too. The car began to take off faster, the jolt throwing me back against my seat. The jolt throwing me back against the seat. These things usually leave most people alone, but every now and then someone will disappear in the night and never be found again. Your friends disappeared because they were trotting right on through a whole nest of them. This is practically their breeding grounds. You, however, they don't want you dead. I didn't know what to say, and I didn't know if I could, but she continued for me anyway. Listen, I'm heading over towards NSW border. I can drop you off at a servo or something. I want you to grab a taxi and get to the nearest airport, get the first ticket back to wherever you came from, and never, ever come back to this country again. All right? I gasped. Wait, aren't you going to tell me what they want me for? She merely shook her head. No. Would have been better if we never knew about any of this. I paused. About what? She glanced over to me. You should have never have come here. Her sudden, unfriendly demeanor only encouraged the dread to swell.
All of a sudden, I had a feeling I shouldn't look back out the window I was resting my head on.
Would have been easier if you just had never known. Would have been more kind.
What? I just... For God's sake, can you just tell me what's going on? She gritted her teeth.
Listen, you gotta run. And you can never stop. Run. Run every day of your life. You're kind. From the moment you were born, they chose you. And they ain't ever gonna stop until they've gotten you too.
She shook her head one final time.
You can run. I'll buy you time.
I gritted my teeth. You say that like there's no getting rid of them. She shook her head.
Nah, someone like you. There ain't no escaping them. Eventually, they'll always catch up to you.
And I'm afraid that's what brings me here, sharing my story. I'm sure it seems boring or long at some parts, and I'm sure some are wondering how I could be so calm while writing all of this. I've since learned that they're far more patient than any mortal being, that they'll wait in the corners of your room until you're finished doing whatever you're doing, before snatching you away into the darkness. This, writing my story to post it here, is an act of running. That woman, when she told me to run, didn't necessarily mean it in a literal sense. These creatures, they'll only ever take you when you're idle, when you're not doing anything, vulnerable. I couldn't tell you why, but it's the only thing that can keep you safe from them. Unfortunately, I can't avoid sleep forever, and glancing over at my phone, sand still wedged in the case. I don't think I can keep running.